coming up. As the greatest conflict in human history raged across nearly every continent, one of the most important battlefields was actually in the skies above. Here, incredible aircraft from all nations battled it out for air supremacy in an attempt to push their side to victory. In this video, we will be specifically looking at the fighter aircraft of this war and, based on historical records, counting down the top 5 warbirds that claim the most aerial victories in the war. Hey guys, TJ here, and before we get into this incredible historic video, when it comes to intimacy, we all want to feel confident. But for a lot of guys out there, erectile dysfunction gets in the way. This issue affects people differently, but it is something that 52% of men will experience. So in reality, more men will experience ED than those who don't. If this sounds like something that you've dealt with, I highly recommend checking out the sponsor of this video, Roman. Roman can connect you directly with a licensed U.S. healthcare professional for a free telehealth consultation from the privacy of your own home. And if appropriate, the provider will find the treatment that is right for you and prescribe an effective medication. The whole process is honestly super simple. So, if this sounds like something that will help you, you can head to getroman.com/TJ3 to complete your free consultation and find out if this is the right treatment for you. And if you use my link, you get $15 off your first ED treatment, which helps you and helps support TJ3 History. That's getroman.com/TJ3, and thanks again to Roman. Without further ado, enjoy. Before we get started with this countdown, I want to make a few notes because I know if I don't cover it, I'm sure to hear about it in the comments. First off, realize that this list is not exactly a list of the best fighters, but simply the top 5 with the highest tallies of the conflict. There were multiple great fighters that simply didn't get a real opportunity to contribute or couldn't be produced in high enough numbers to make a big impact. Secondly, it should be noted that these numbers should be taken with a grain of salt, because these tallies are very difficult to accurately count, because you not only have to dive into the historical records, but you must also combine the kills accrued across multiple theaters and time periods while relying on tallies from pilots and fighter groups, which can sometimes be inflated or poorly recorded. With that being said, I have done my best to try and compile this information based on the best sources that I could. Enjoy. To start off with, I'm actually going to cover some honorable mentions because I simply wouldn't feel right if these aircraft weren't at least mentioned on the list. First, the P-40 Warhawk and the Hawker Hurricane both earn honorable mentions. Two of my personal favorite aircraft, but these fighters were simply in their prime in the first year or two of the war, and then essentially became obsolete as the conflict progressed. Great fighters nonetheless, but neither was able to serve enough in the war to rack up a top 5 kill count. Next, the Japanese Zero will also be an honorable mention. This is one of the most iconic aircraft from this conflict, and certainly was one of the deadliest in the hands of a skilled pilot. But unfortunately for Japan, they were not able to keep up with technological improvements made by the United States, and so although it was an absolutely deadly fighter in the first years of the war, its lethality waned as better armored and faster US aircraft became far superior to this nimble fighter. In addition, Japan began to lose many of their skilled pilots after the Battle of Midway, in part because they very rarely bailed out of planes. Thus, this great fighter was never able to achieve a top 5 kill tally in the war. Then finally, the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning will also receive honorable mentions. Although they were, without a doubt, huge assets in the war, they actually do not have kill counts that put them on this list. The P-47 racked up an estimated 3,700 victories, while the P-38 would end the war with around 3,800. Now, let's get into our top 5. In the 5th slot for our countdown today, we will go to a US Navy fighter, the F-6F Hellcat, with an estimated 5,200 kills. The Grumman Hellcat was placed in a prime spot to succeed in the war as it entered the conflict relatively late and primarily in the Pacific theater. This carrier-based fighter was essentially designed to be the answer for the Japanese Zero, and it certainly served this role well. Using the same engine as the P-47, the Hellcat could achieve speeds of 380 miles per hour, and although it was less maneuverable than the Zero, it made up for it with speed and armor. It used 6 wing-mounted 50 caliber machine guns to make quick work of the vulnerable Japanese fighters, and was able to contribute greatly to the domination of the skies in the Pacific in 44 and 45. In the course of the war, only 270 Hellcats were lost in aerial combat, while racking up thousands of enemy fighters destroyed. This kill count would be the second highest of any US fighter plane, and would be enough to earn the 5th overall score in the war. Taking the next spot in our countdown is a deadly fighter of the German Luftwaffe in the Focke-Wulf 190. This fighter was one of the most advanced used in the European theater of war, and packed a lethal load of firepower with an armament of both machine guns and 20mm cannons. It also had great speeds and maneuverability, and was a formidable opponent for any American or British plane it encountered in the skies. The 190 was not as widely used as the German Bf 109, but was a favorite among many German aces like Otto Kittel and Walter Nowotny. The total kill count of the 190 is actually a little bit more difficult to tabulate, and is certainly the most vague of all that I have put together in this list. This is because not only do you have to dig into the German aerial victory records, but you also have to separate the pilots who switched over to the 190 after using the 109, making it a very difficult number to count. With that being said, I think that it is reasonable to assume that the Focke-Wulf may have likely downed anywhere from 5,000 to 7,000 Allied planes in the course of the war. These kill numbers could be more or less, but it is likely that this is a good estimate based on the number of 190s that were in use and the skill of the pilots that were flying them in the late years of the war, where it primarily saw action. Since I was unable to nail down an exact number, I didn't want to put it any higher on the list, but I certainly feel that this fighter should be no lower than number 4. Coming up next is the American fighter plane that truly dominated the skies in 1944 and 45 with the North American P-51 Mustang, with an estimated total of 5,900 total enemy aircraft destroyed. Like the F-6F earlier on this list, the Mustang boasted 6 50 caliber machine guns as an armament, but unlike the F-6F, the P-51 had an extremely long range that made it ideal for bomber escort. This greatly contributed to the success of the Allied bomber campaigns over Europe, and helped win the contest for air superiority against the Luftwaffe. One key factor that added to the success of the P-51 that should be noted is that as the Mustang entered service, it was able to be produced extremely quickly by the American war machine, and the US had no shortage of pilots to fly it. In addition, in late 1944 and 45, many of the best German pilots had already been killed or captured, leaving the Mustang left with a great number of inexperienced adversaries in the skies. Because of these factors, this famous warbird was able to take down a huge number of enemy aircraft in the war, earning it a well-deserved spot at number 3 on this list. Coming in at number 2 and just ahead of the Mustang is one of the most recognizable and famous fighters in history, with the Supermarine Spitfire and an estimated total of 6,300 aerial kills. This renowned British fighter saw action from the beginning of the conflict all the way to the very end, and was the primary fighter of the Royal Air Force. This fighter was absolutely loved by its pilots, and was one of the fastest aircraft in the world at the time it first saw flight. It also had a turn radius and maneuverability that were essentially unmatched. The highlight of its role in the war was probably in the Battle of Britain, where it helped drive back the German fighters and bombers attempting to bomb England into submission. The Spitfire would be updated throughout the war and would see many modifications that included cannons, which allowed it to maintain its status as an intimidating aircraft for the entire duration of the war. In addition, the Spitfire saw action for multiple nations, including the Soviets and the US Army Air Force. One of the reasons this fighter was likely able to log more victories than the Mustang is because it was one of the few fighters that actually participated as a frontline aircraft for the entire duration of the conflict. And in these years, as it was able to compile one of the most successful records in air combat history, it has thoroughly earned the number 2 spot on this list for the highest scoring aircraft. Now, finally, taking the spot for the highest scoring aircraft in World War II and in history is the German Messerschmitt Bf 109. This aircraft easily takes the number 1 spot with an absolutely staggering kill total that is not perfectly approximated, but is likely between 15,000 and 20,000 total aerial victories, which is well ahead of any other aircraft that saw combat during the war. This overwhelming total is easily explained by a few simple factors. First, the Bf 109 was the most mass-produced fighter in history, and so it obviously saw a great deal of action. The 109, like the Spitfire, saw many upgrades and models over the years that allowed it to remain as an up-to-date fighter throughout the entirety of the conflict. It continued to be the backbone of the Luftwaffe and saw action in high numbers from the very first day of the war until the last. In addition, since the Bf 109 saw combat in the very first days of the war, the cutting-edge fighter was able to go up against inferior aircraft very early on, and the German pilots handled them with ease. This allowed the 109 to create more aces than any other plane in history, including over 100 pilots that tallied more than 100 kills. Now, of course, there are a good deal of historians who question some of the German aces' kill claims on their extremely high counts, with many of the Luftwaffe aces scoring well over 200 and 300 victories. But even if we did account for some inflation in the German numbers, taking off a solid share of these claims, the infamous Messerschmitt fighter would still take the number 1 spot by a gaping lead. In fact, the famous JG-52 fighter unit, which flew primarily on the Eastern Front, is credited with 10,000 victories alone. This means that if we did account for up to a 20 to 25% inflation number on the German records, JG-52 alone scored more kills than the Spitfire, Mustang, or Hellcat. It is because of this the title solely belongs to the Bf 109, and it is well deserved after its incredibly long and successful record as a fighter plane. Thank you guys so much for watching this historical recreation. If you want to support my content, please check out my fan store here and make sure to click subscribe right here. And if you want to go above and beyond, feel free to support me on Patreon, which can be found in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.